Richard the Lionheart. You hear that name, right? And you probably think of a noble crusader, the ultimate knight in shining armor. Well, what if I told you there's a medieval story out there that paints a very different picture? Let's get into it.
So what if that whole legend we know and love? What if it was torn apart on purpose? And not by some modern historian trying to be controversial, but by people from his own era, centuries ago.
What if, to them, this famous king wasn't a hero at all? I mean, it's a pretty wild question, right? And the answer comes from a source that is way older than you might think.
Okay, so what we're talking about here is a 14th century text called Richard Coer de Lyon. Now, you gotta understand, this isn't some dry historical account trying to get all the facts straight. Nope, this was popular entertainment. Think of it like the medieval version of a summer blockbuster. And in this movie, Richard is violent, he's treacherous, he's frankly terrifying.
But, before we dive into the whole monster part, we have to talk about the legend first. We really need to get a handle on the heroic image that this story was working so hard to completely demolish.
Right, so this is the Richard you probably know from the storybooks. The perfect knight, right? The heroic leader of the Third Crusade. A warrior so unbelievably brave that even his famous rival, Saladin, respected him. He's basically the gold standard for a medieval hero. But this romance, oh man, it takes that gold standard and just smashes it to pieces.
So this story asks this really unsettling question when you think about it. What's the real difference between a heroic knight and a ravenous monster? And its answer? Well, it's that the line between them is razor thin, dangerously, terrifyingly thin.
Okay, and what's so fascinating here is how the story defines monster. It's not what you'd expect. We're not talking about some beast with claws and fangs. No, in this story, monstrosity is all about behavior. It's about breaking the chivalric code by going way too far. Too much violence, too much greed. It's about causing harm to people who just plain don't deserve it.
And this comparison just lays it all out perfectly. You've got the ideal knight on one side, pious, merciful, restrained. Then on the other side, you've got the monstrous knight, violent, dishonest, and completely self-serving. And according to this story, Richard is planted firmly in that second column. No question about it.
So, the big question is, how does the story actually make its case? Well, it doesn't pull any punches. It just lays out one horrifying act after another, systematically taking a wrecking ball to his heroic reputation.
All right, let's take this dishonorable duel, for instance. Richard is a prisoner in Germany, and he agrees to a bare-knuckle fight. This German prince, Ardor, he takes his shot totally fair, just like they agreed. But Richard, he gets his pride hurt. So the next day, he decides to cheat. He actually whacks his hand to make his punch harder. He hits Ardor and kills him. I mean, come on. That's not a fair fight. It's just a petty, dishonorable murder.
And get this. To explain where all this monstrosity comes from, the romance gives him a demonic mother. Seriously. So forget Eleanor of Aquitaine. In this version, his mom is this mysterious princess, Cassodorien, who absolutely cannot stand to be near anything holy. One day, when she's forced to stay for Mass, she literally flies out through the roof of the church to get away. The message here is pretty clear. Richard's evil isn't just a bad habit, it's in his blood.
60,000. Just let that number sink in for a second. That's how many Saracen hostages were executed on Richard's orders after the siege of Acre. The scale of it is just staggering. It's meant to shock you, to show a level of cruelty that goes way, way beyond what's necessary in war.
See, Richard had demanded a huge ransom and the return of the true cross. But Saracens basically said, and this is a quote, "We don't know where the cross is." They literally couldn't give him what he wanted. So what was Richard's response? Was it negotiation? Mercy? Nope. It was just slaughter. A total massacre. And as horrifying as all that is, the story saves its most shocking, its most disturbing accusation for the very end. It argues that Richard's true monstrosity wasn't found on the battlefield. It was found at the dinner table.
So the story goes like this. Richard gets super sick, and he gets this intense, unshakable craving for pork. He's absolutely convinced it's the only thing that's going to save him. The only problem? There's no pork anywhere in the camp. His cooks are terrified of what he'll do to them, so they improvise. They find something else and serve it to him, just hoping and praying he won't know the difference.
And what do you know, Richard eats the meal and feels instantly better. He is so thrilled, he jumps up and declares that the army's food shortages are over. He says, "I and my folk shall eat more." So, when his cooks finally get the nerve to tell him what he just ate, he isn't horrified, oh no, he's delighted.
So, what was it? What was this so-called miracle cure? What was the secret ingredient that fed his monstrous nature so perfectly? You guessed it, they served him the cooked flesh of a young Saracen prisoner, and Richard loved it. By turning their hero into a cannibal, that's the ultimate human taboo, the story just completely demolishes any claim he has to being a pious, chivalrous knight. He's not just a brutal warrior at this point, he's something inhuman. But here's where the story's critique gets even broader. Because, sure, Richard might be the main monster of the story, but he's not the only one, not by a long shot. The romance is arguing that the entire crusade was rotten to the core with greed and infighting. So that whole idea of a united Christian army? Yeah, forget about it. This is how they actually talked about each other. The French called the English tailardes, which means tailed ones, like they were demons or dogs. And the English called the Greeks griffon, like those greedy, monstrous griffins. They were throwing the exact same kind of monstrous insults at each other that they were using on their supposed enemy.
In fact, it gets even crazier. Sometimes this story actually paints the Saracens in a better light than Richard's own Christian allies. The French are called cowardly and greedy, but the Saracens are described as wary and cunning and ingenious. That is a shocking reversal of the kind of crusader propaganda you'd normally expect to see.
And it really goes after the French king, Philip. He's painted as this total traitor who takes bribes from Saladin and then just ditches the crusade for his own personal gain. The message of the story couldn't be clearer. The crusade didn't fail because the Saracens were so strong. It failed because of the moral rot inside the Christian army itself.
So you have to ask, why tell a story like this? Why on earth would you turn your national hero into a cannibal? Well, it's because the story is making a really powerful critique of the whole idea of the Crusades. It's basically saying that the unchecked violence and the pure greed of the leaders had turned them into the exact same monsters they claimed they were fighting.
And all of this leaves us with a question that's just as relevant today as it was then, and it's a deeply uncomfortable one. You see, this medieval story, it isn't really just about Richard the Lionheart. It's asking something much, much bigger. If our own heroes can act like monsters, and if that line between good and evil gets so blurry, then how do we ever really know who's worth following?